My question concerns your vision of a libertarian socialism and the way that we might get there. And what do you see as institutions in our society today, or structures you think that we can build on to move toward a society of justice and solidarity?
Well, the last two words define the vision, I think. Justice, solidarity, freedom, equal rights. These are all ideas that come straight out of the Enlightenment, and in fact out of classical liberalism, classical liberalism is very anti-capitalist, contrary to what everybody says. And classical liberal and the Enlightenment ideals lead in a very direct path, I think, to what was called libertarian socialism or anarchism or something like that. The idea that people have a fundamental core right and need to be free, creative, not under external constraints, that any form of authority requires legitimation. The burden of proof is always on an authoritarian structure, whatever it may be, whether it's owning people or sex-linked or whatever, child parent. Any form of authority has to be challenged. Sometimes they can be justified, maybe in that case, okay, you live with them. But for the most part not. And that would then lead quite directly to what were kind of truisms about a century ago. I mean, now they sound really crazy because there's been such a deterioration of values. But if you look at the thinking of just ordinary people, like say the working class press in the mid-19th century, which grew, where the ideas just grew out of the same soil, Enlightenment, classical liberal soil. The idea is, look, obviously people should not be machines. They shouldn't be tools of production. They shouldn't be ordered around. We don't want chattel slavery, like black slaves in the South, but we also don't want what was called since the 18th century wage slavery, which is not very different, namely where you have to rent yourself to survive. And in a way, it was argued with some plausibility that you're worse off than a slave that way. Actually, slave owners argued that. When slave owners were defending slavery, there was a kind of a moral debate that went on, and it had shared moral turf, as a lot of moral debate did. And the slave owners made a plausible point. They said, look, we own our workers. You just rent your workers. When you own something, you take much better care of it than when you rent it. Like, to do it a little anachronistically, if you rent a car, you're not going to pay as much attention to taking care of it as if you own the car, for obvious reasons. Similarly, if you own people, you're going to take more care of them than if you rent people. You rent people, you don't want them anymore, you throw them out. You own people, well, you got a sort of an investment in them, so you make them healthier and so on. So the slave owners, in fact, argued, and that, look, we're a lot more moral than you guys with your capitalist wage slave system. And ordinary working people understood that. So, people would, like after the Civil War, you find in the American working class press bitter complaints over the fact that, look, we fought to end chattel slavery and now you're driving us into wage slavery, which is the same sort of thing. Well, okay, this is one core institution of the society where people are forced to become tools of others, machines, tools of others to be cast out if they're not necessary. I mean, that's just a grotesque arrangement, totally contrary to the ideals of classical liberalism or Enlightenment values or anything else. And it's now become a sort of standard doctrine, but that's just a victory of absolutism. And we should dismantle all that stuff culturally. It starts with cultural changes. You got to change your minds, and your spirit, and recover what was common understanding in a more civilized period, let's say a century ago, in the shop floors of Lowell, Massachusetts, and so on. Recover that understanding, and then we work to simply democratize in all institutions, free them up, eliminate authoritarian structures. As I say, you find them everywhere. I mean, you find them from families up to corporations, all kind of authoritarian structures in the world. They all ought to be challenged. Very few of them can resist that challenge. They survive mainly because they're not challenged. They're not really very strong. They look strong, but there's a point that was made by David Hume a couple hundred years ago, with it's worth bearing in mind. Hume was very conservative, as you know. He was so much so that Thomas Jefferson, the great believer in free speech, when he established the University of Virginia, to be a counter to Harvard, you know, so they wouldn't send Southern gentlemen up to be distorted by the Northern, you know, Federalists. He was the founder of the University of Virginia, and you had to read the history of England in those. I mean, universities mainly law schools in those days, like you're training lawyers and people, and naturally had to read the history of England. And unfortunately, the main history of England was by David Hume, who had Tory ideas. He's very conservative, and Jefferson didn't want the students to be allowed to read it. So there was a Bowdlerized version. Somebody had written a version of Hume in which he had kept the same style but eliminated all the offending passages, you know. So Jefferson insisted that that be the only version that students be allowed to read. They would be told it's Hume and so on, but that's Hume. Anyway, even though, you know, much too conservative to be allowed to be read by Thomas Jefferson's college, still he recognized, you look at his fundamental principles of government, he recognized something which is very much worth bearing in mind. He raised a kind of paradox of power. He said, how does power sustain itself? He said, if you think about it, power is always in the hands of the people who are oppressed. It's in the hands of the governed. They really have power. And this is true of the most oppressive society, what we would call totalitarian society, as of the most free. Power is in the hands of the governed, so how come they submit themselves to the authority of others? He said, well, force is an element, but he said the real element is opinion. You have to control their opinion. Of course, he was in favor of it. You know, he's a Tory. So he says, well, what you have to do is make sure you control the opinion of the people, meaning make them believe, you know, make them saturate their minds with ideology, carry out what we call propaganda. Didn't have the term in those days. And control their opinion, and you got them. That means you change their aspirations, you restrict their aspirations to personal things, to commodities, to break down the natural bonds among people, force them to forget what they understand, you know, that they basically want freedom and independence and justice and so on. Every child understands that. So you have to work really hard to drive it out of their heads. And if you can drive it out of their heads and you control their opinion, then they'll submit. You know, and they'll submit whether you're a brutal state or a more free society. In fact, it's more important in the free societies. In the 20th century, when in Hume's day, there wasn't much difference. Every society was absolutist. But as the societies differentiated over the years with popular struggles and, you know, winning the franchise and so on and so forth, the difference between the freer societies and the more, you know, like totalitarian or command societies became clearer, and a point began to be understood that Hume didn't talk about, and that is that control of opinion is much more important in the free societies. So like in, say, Soviet Russia, they didn't really care much what people thought. Franco Spain, let's say, you know, fascist state, people read much more broadly and widely than they do in the United States. I mean, like say, I mean, it's true, in fact. You know, you go to a Marxist bookstore, you know. I mean, if you got out of line too much, okay, they send you to the torture chamber in downtown Madrid. But since there were techniques of control, just by force, there was not much, you know, wasn't much concern about what people thought. It's sort of believe what you like, we'll beat you over the head with a bludgeon, you know. When you get to the freer societies, there's a lot more concern with what people think. And that has been understood. That's part of the reason for the rise of the public relations industry in the United States. Public relations industry is a propaganda agency of business, it's an American creation. You know, it was created in the early part of the century to try to, as they put it then, to control people's minds. And that's, you know, I don't know if they read Hume, but, you know, it's not a deep point. Anybody can understand it without reading Hume. They understood that unless you control people's minds, we're going to be in trouble. People's mind, you know, what was called in the business press, the greatest hazard facing industrialists is the rising political power of the masses. I'm quoting. I mean, you should recognize that the business press is very Marxist, super Marxist. I mean, all the values are inverted, but they believe in class struggle. They talk about the masses, and beating down the masses and all that sort of thing. In fact, business press reads kind of like Maoist tracts, little red books and things, just with all the values reversed. And they understood that you've got to control people's opinion because, as Hume put it, power is in the hands of the governed, if they ever realize it. And if they realize it and they try to recognize what their own values are and pursue them, we're really going to be in trouble because there's not going to be any way to control people. Well, okay, you ask what institutions can change things. I think if you think it through, it's kind of obvious. You have to start by changing people's minds. I mean, take, say, something pretty close to here. Take, say, liberation theology in the 70s and 60s and 70s. How did it work? Well, people, priests and nuns went and started base communities where people read the Gospels and they thought about it. Peasants, maybe illiterate people, who knows, but they thought about what it meant. They gave their own, you can interpret it in a lot of ways. They gave an interpretation which was oriented toward the preferential option for the poor. People began to do things like, I saw some of this happening. You go to I remember once going to a village in Nicaragua, which was run by an extremely conservative order of nuns. I forget which one, but the one that runs all the schools for girls in Latin America. I forget who they are. You probably know. But, there's real ultra right-wing, but they were working in a village where the peasants were so isolated from one another that they couldn't even work together to the point of trying to get water. And one of their biggest, and they were good people. I mean, the Mother Superior was walking around, trying to convince people to get injections and things like that. And their big achievement when I was there was that they had gotten the peasants to cooperate enough to work on a common well. They had you wouldn't believe the way it worked. There was this is real poor country. So they had an ox, and they had a rope tied to the neck of the ox, or however it works, and it was pulling the ox climbed up a hill, and as it climbed up a hill, it pulled water out of the well, and then people would come and take the water. It's the first water they ever had. Then the ox would be led down to the bottom of the hill again and would walk up. Okay, that was a real achievement, and it was helping bring people to understand. Look, you work together, we're all better off. The kind of authoritarian regime that you've lived under, which kept you separated and kept you isolated, is just destroying you. To try to get those thoughts into people's heads is hard. And once it gets started, it goes on, and then they develop cooperatives and associations. And then, of course, the death squads come, and the U.S. trainers come, and people like you and me pay taxes to killers who will put an end to all of this. Well, okay, you think this through, it's not very hard to figure out what ought to be done, whether it's there or whether it's here. And the aim ought to be to dismantle authoritarian institutions. And like I say, they're all over the place. You find them in the family, but the core ones, the ones that simply have to be radically changed if you're ever going to have a free society, are the institutions the institutions that involve production and distribution and decision about what life is going to be like. And that happens to be in executive boardrooms, like the hotel where I was staying last night. You walk around and you see who's making the decisions. Not very hard to find them. And those sectors of society, with their extraordinary power, it's now, even international, and huge agglomerations of power. They have plenty of violence behind them. Much of it is provided by the United States. There's a reason why we have more than half of the total military expenditures of the whole world. The reason is because we're the big killers, and we have to be around to make sure that nobody gets out of hand. Peasants start building a well, we've got to be in there to have a death squad that'll take care of them. And that's a lot of what we're involved in. And you and I are involved in it, because this is a pretty free country. Like, if we're involved in it, we decided to be involved in it, or we decided to look the other way, or something like that. Okay, those are things that can be done. And on, up till the point where you just dismantle. And I don't think these institutions are very strong. I agree with Hume. If people change their conceptions and decide, look, I'm not going to be kicked around, and you get together, there's nothing to stop you from taking over a factory, let's say. I mean, the police will stop you, but if the police are just other people, and if understanding and solidarity has spread enough, they won't stop you. Incidentally, that's why when countries are ruled by either colonial rulers or every country is kind of colonized, you know, even if it's just in itself. I mean, there's some sector that colonizes everyone else. And it's even more dramatically obvious when it's a foreign ruler. What they typically do is use military forces that are not local. So like when in China, when they put down the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, you take a look at what they did. They did not use the local PLA, you know, army forces. They took them in from the provinces. When the British ran India, for 100 years, they ran it with Indian soldiers, but from other places, like the Gurkhas, for example. You know, famous Gurkhas, they're Nepalese, you know, hill tribesmen, and you could sort of bring them down to smash up the local people. We do the same thing. We bring in, you know, sort of forces from the outside. Actually, it's going on right now in the occupied territories, in the Israeli occupied territories. The Israel-Arafat agreement, one crucial part of it is to make sure that those territories are controlled by foreigners. They're called Palestinians, but in fact they are foreign Palestinians. Ones who are trained, who are brigades of the Jordanian army or something like that. They're the ones who are being brought in. That's the standard technique of colonial control. So, you know, when you bring in, when they wanted to put down the Homestead strike in 1892, they get the National Guard from somewhere else, you know, not the local cops in Homestead. So yeah, there are police and there are armies and there are security forces, but, you know, and there are techniques which are well understood for using them. And the answer to that is just more solidarity, you know, broader solidarity. So you don't get soldiers from somewhere else who'll come and smash up people. That's hard, you know. I mean, it's the fact that societies are colonized and so stratified offers all kinds. It means you don't have to go very far away. Like when the Chicago police were trying to destroy political organizing in the Black Ghetto back in the 60s. They were able to work together with other criminal organizations like them, the FBI, and simply set up assassinations and other criminal activities to get rid of leaders in the Black Ghetto, which they did. And, you know, they happened to come from Chicago, but they came from a different stratum of Chicago, which was so separated it might as well have been from, you know, Alaska. And it's because of the stratifications and so on that these things work. Actually, it's kind of interesting. If you look at the details, it's very illuminating. So take Chicago. When the FBI was trying to, the Panthers in Chicago back in the 60s were a pretty constructive group. They were doing real things, a lot of community organizing and so on. And the main Panther leader was a guy named Fred Hampton. Maybe some of you know this stuff. This is your own history. You really ought to know it, a recent history. But at first, the FBI tried to use the colonization that is internal to the Black Ghetto. That is, they tried to get a black criminal gang to assassinate Hampton. Now, typically, the police and the FBI like the criminals. They work with them. They're more or less the same class and the same interests, and they're all involved in the same control system, so there's a lot of interaction, like Colombia or anywhere else. You know, the security forces and the criminals are all in the same bag. You know, they have the same interest. So the FBI, in fact, had pretty good relations with the main criminal gang in the ghetto, which was the Blackstone Rangers. And they tried to get the Rangers to kill Fred Hampton. The way they did it was by, a lot of this stuff came out in court cases right here in Chicago later. They sent fake letters to the head of the FBI, I didn't know it. Namely, there was enough development had taken place so that the Rangers and the Panthers were integrated. They were working together, you know, and they had broken down these barriers. And therefore they knew at once that it was a police fake, you know, so nothing happened. And then the FBI had to mobilize another colonial force, namely Chicago police, and bring them in, and they did the job. They assassinated him in a straight Gestapo-style assassination. I mean, nothing covered up about it except by the press. But and it's very clear what happened, isn't it? That, okay, that's the kind of thing that happens in small detail, but it also happens in, you know, big, much bigger frame. And that's the kind of thing you have to overcome, recognizing Hume's point exactly. If you can control opinion, you know, if you can get people to think for themselves, and to work together, it's going to be very hard to do these things. So that's the method. It's always been the method for getting anywhere. It was the method for getting rid of slavery, for getting rid of feudalism, for feminism in the last 30, 40 years, for the achievements of liberation theology in Latin America until they were destroyed by violence in that case, because they couldn't compete with U.S. violence. It's just a matter of, and that's our fault. The fact that it was destroyed is our fault. We couldn't control our own criminals, and they were able to destroy it. But I think if these things all tell you exactly what you have to do, and there's plenty of opportunities. I mean, we don't face death squads like they do in Central America, say. Oh, gee, I'm sorry. I'm talking too much as usual. Yeah. Shorter answers, right. Yeah. You are authoritarian.
I'd like to switch the focus to media control. In American society, a morphine or almost removal of the distinction between pure information and the truth. What is the method of reversing this process, and what steps are involved?
First of all, I don't think it's got to do anything with modern America. I mean, it's always been the case, and there's perfectly good reasons for it, and the reasons go back to Hume's insight. I mean, you tell people the truth, you're in trouble. Why should you do it? So therefore, you try to control their opinion. That means mostly lie or mislead or distort and so on. What's the method for overcoming it? I mean, we all know that. What's the point of asking? We all know exactly what the method is. Try to be honest. Be honest, try to figure out the truth for yourself, work with others to try to figure it out, try to disseminate it. It's not a big trick. I mean, like if any of you take science courses, like this tech biology, what do you try to do in a biology course? Well, you try to find out the truth. If it happens to undermine what somebody else believed, well, fine, it undermines it. That's the way the game's played. And there's a little certain tiny sector of academic life, namely the natural sciences, in which this is just taken for granted. And the reason it's taken for granted is if you don't do it, you get nowhere, and somebody else does it and you're out of business. But in most fields of humanities and social sciences and so on, you don't have that kind of external discipline. Mother Nature isn't standing there forcing you to be honest. And therefore there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of latitude for distortion and deceit. But the same techniques that are used in the sciences ought to be used here, and there's nothing. There's no big secret about them. Everybody knows how to be honest. Everybody knows how to try to find out what's actually going on. I mean, you have to have experience. You have to see what kind of deceit there's been in the past, and you have to know what to look for and so on. But these aren't esoteric skills. This isn't quantum physics. I mean, this kind of stuff is available to everybody. That's why illiterate peasants in Latin America were able to do it very easily. Or workers in, Lowell, Massachusetts, 150 years ago. It's because it's obvious. The skills are deceit. There's not much skill involved in being honest. In fact, a lot of your university and school and university training is teaching you how to carry out the skills of distortion and deceit. That's hard. It's much harder to tell lies and tell the truth. I mean, everybody knows that from their own lives. You want to tell the truth about something you did, it's usually pretty easy. If you want to try to justify some rotten thing you did by making up lies, it's usually pretty hard. And that's true whether it's that, you stole a toy from your 3-year-old brother or anything else. Telling the truth is always very easy, except for the personal cost that may be associated. But there's no skills to learn.
How are we massaged?
How? Well, just take any day's paper and you're just deluged with it. You have to ask, what's the relationship between what's being described and what in fact is happening? Okay, so I don't know, I was just looking at the New York Times while I was eating breakfast, and it's full of examples. You can start with page 1 and run right through. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion about anti-politics. There's this great mood of anti-politics in the country. Well, interestingly, they actually quote somebody who tells the truth, some working class person who says, yeah, Congress is rotten, and the reason is Congress is big business. Okay, that's true. The reason why Congress is rotten is because Congress is big business, and big business runs the country, and that's rotten. But try to find that discussed somewhere. So that means that the problem isn't anti-politics. You know, it's not opposition to government. It's not the stuff that's in all the headlines, anti-politics. The problem is the authoritarian control that happens to use politics as its medium. So you're supposed to see the politics, and but not see the control that's hidden behind. Well, that's actually, it was obvious to this guy they quoted, but that's hidden. All right, there's one example. Or take the article on Haiti. Actually, a good reporter down there, John Kiffner of the New York Times, he's actually the guy who exposed the police raid against the police assassination of Hampton. He was never able to publish much about it. Like the Times Magazine wouldn't run a story that he wrote about it. He was a young reporter then, and he exposed the lies. The Chicago press was simply reporting the police lies. But he actually went to the room and noticed that the gunshots were all inside, not outside, and exposed it. And he's a pretty good reporter. I suspect that's one reason he never gets anywhere on the New York Times. Like he's the one older reporter who's never been a bureau chief or anything like that. Anyhow, he's an honest reporter, and when he goes somewhere, he usually tells the truth. Okay, so he's in Haiti now, and he's telling the truth. I mean, the truth is that the American forces there, the Haitians have been told you're not supposed to take revenge. In other words, impunity reigns. Those were our killers, and you're not allowed to go after them. No justice. That's the rule. But so the Haitians are doing it. Like they're finding these attachés, these murderers, the paramilitaries who the security forces use to do most of their dirty work, and they're handing them over to the American Army, because that's what they're told to do by Aristide and others. Just don't kill them, hand them over to the American Army. So what's the American Army doing? Well, it's handing them over to the Haitian police. That is the guys they always worked with and worked for. I mean, it's like, taking some Nazi killer and handing him over to the Gestapo to take care of him. So, of course, what happens is the Haitian police release them. And in fact, Kiffner points out there that, they're supposed to have gone to the National Penitentiary, but then he checked at the National Penitentiary and they're not there, Well, what happened? You don't have to be a big genius to figure it out. All right, if you read through this, you begin to understand exactly what the U.S. invasion is about. I mean, it's about maintaining the traditional power structure, including its military apparatus, which we set up in the first place. Now, that's not what the headline says. You have to sort of read it with minimal intelligence to figure out that that's what it means. And if you go, or take, there's a big story on North Korea. Clinton, huge foreign policy triumph. Clinton succeeded in getting North Korea to shift its nuclear weapons production over to some other form of production. Minor footnote, that's exactly what North Korea's been asking for the last couple of years. And in fact, you don't have to go very far to find that out here. You can go down the street to Northwestern University, where they have I happened to meet him at breakfast this morning. There's a friend of mine named Bruce Cummings, who's the world's, the leading expert on Korea in the United States. He's been pointing this out for years, but he can't get into the press, even though he's the major American specialist on Korea, the guy who wrote the big, fat, 1,000-page books and so on. But he can't get interviewed, can't get in the press. Why? Well, because he's been saying exactly what's been obvious, and which is now presented as a great triumph of American diplomacy, because, ultimately, after having waved fists around and, gotten near war and had military maneuvers, we finally turned out to be politically expedient to do it. Okay, that's another story. And we can just go on from there, You ask how it's done, take a look at any column in the newspaper, you'll figure out how it's done. And in fact, read your textbooks, and you'll find out the same thing, because they're not very different. I don't know who's calling on people. Are you? Yeah. Okay.
Do you believe that the general public will remain marginalized for the rest of U.S. history, or do you believe there will be
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I think there's one thing that we can predict with fair certainty. If the U.S. public remains marginalized, there isn't going to be much history to worry about. Because we're not living in the 18th century. The problems may be sort of similar, but they're quite different in scale. And the problems that are not very far away have to do with human survival. And hence, if the public in the most powerful country in the world remains marginalized, we don't have to worry much about history because there isn't going to be any. So like take, say, Central America, which is the region that we have most control. We've controlled it for 100 years, so that tells us really what we are. It's quite possible that much of Central America will be uninhabitable in another couple of decades. Like Nicaragua, for example, which is one of the main targets of our attack. Actually, we attacked Nicaragua first in 1854. That's when the U.S. Navy first shelled Nicaragua, and it's been that way since then, so we have a lot of influence there. It's losing its water supply. The reason is that people are so desperate after the American attacks, which intensified in the 80s, that they're starving, and they're going up to doing the only thing they can. You know, you go up in the hills to cut wood and try to find some land to work and so on. That eliminates the forest cover. Streams start drying up. The land can't absorb water. Lakes are drying up. There's on top, it happens to be a drought, but the water supply may disappear. And as the pressures continue, it may become a desert. That could be true of Haiti. Haiti, in fact, is kind of like almost a parable of Western savagery. I mean, when Columbus landed, that was the first place Columbus landed, Haiti, and he thought it was a paradise. You know, it was the richest place in the world, also probably the most densely populated place in the world. And in fact, it remained that way. I mean, France is a rich country because, in large measure, because they stole Haiti's resources. Haiti was the richest colony in the world right through the 18th century. In fact, early in this century, right before Woodrow Wilson invaded Haiti, you look at the American government studies and so on, scholarship, they were still describing Haiti as a major resource center. It happened to be an extremely rich place. Well, when you fly into Haiti today, you know, as you fly in, you see that the island is Haiti and Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic we've also brutalized, but Haiti much more so. When you fly over the border, you see it. On one side it's brown, on the other side it's sort of semi-green. The brown side is Haiti, the richest place in the world. You know, it may not last another decade or more, and literally it may become totally uninhabitable. And that's extending elsewhere. And it involves us too, you know, like the rich and the powerful are going to survive longer, but these effects are very real. And they're getting worse. You know, they're getting worse as more and more people are getting marginalized. I mean, the percentage of the world's population that has no role in profit-making is increasing. And if profit-making is the only human value, that part of the population, bigger and bigger here too, is going to become destructive because there's nothing else for them to do. And when you're destructive these days, it's not like being destructive 200 years ago. The techniques of destruction are vastly escalated. The environmental problems, for example, are much more significant in scale. I mean, nobody really understands much about complicated things like, you know, the weather and so on. But there's a fair possibility, I mean, a possibility high enough so that no rational person would exclude it, that within a couple hundred years, the water level, the world's water level, will have risen high enough so that most of human life will have been destroyed. Well, you know, we don't do anything about that. It's not impossible that that'll happen. In fact, it's even likely. So the answer is, if you remain marginalized, there's not going to be much history to worry about. And whether people will react or not, who knows? That's free. You know, everyone's got to decide. I don't think so. In fact, American history has been rather different. I mean, look, there's a lot of problems. The political system was, in fact, set up as very anti-democratic. You have to remember, all the founding fathers hated democracy. Jefferson was a partial exception, but only partial. But for the most part, they hated democracy. The U.S. didn't even become formally democratic until about the mid-19th century. The original idea was that, I'm quoting now, the people who own the country ought to govern it. That was the favorite maxim of John Jay, the first chief, head of, what do you call him, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and, head of the Constitutional Convention, and so on. The people who own the country ought to govern it. That was the principle on which the country was founded. But if you look at the way it worked over the years, it turned out very often that concentration of power in Washington empowered people as distinct from concentration of power in states. And there were reasons for that. Businesses in power, the people who own the country are there everywhere. But in states, locally, they're often more powerful. And they can often concentrate more power in the states than they can in the federal government, where, let's say, national popular movements were able to influence them. So if you look at some of the things that really improved the country, like, in the New Deal measures, which sort of brought the United States partially, at least into the main framework of industrial society, most of that was coming from Washington and against the states. And in fact, if you really look at who was behind it, it was often big business as opposed to small business. Like big corporations like, say, General Electric, who had small labor forces and they were very capital intensive and had international orientations. They were supporting New Deal measures. The mainstream business was opposing them. It was labor intensive and it wasn't internationalized. And for a corporation like GE, it was better to have an organized workforce that didn't carry out wildcat strikes and that, you could be sure was going to work pretty regularly, even if you paid them a little more money, because they weren't labor intensive anyway. And the combination of centralized big business and powerful popular movements operating through Washington was able to overcome the more distributed power of private power that was in the states. Well, those are things that happen in societies based on power, power structures. So I don't think it's true that centralization is a bad thing in principle, but not when you have private power. When you have private power, centralization can sometimes be a good thing, although ultimately it's a bad thing, and you want to decentralize, but only after other structures of power are dismantled. And you can see it from American history. You really look at the details of American history, you see this working out. Quite commonly, the power of the central government has been able to overcome the private power, which is more decentralized, in the interests of the population. Not always, but sometimes. So I don't think there are any simple formulas about that. The real problem is the private power.
All right, one more question.
I grew up watching the 6 o'clock news, the New York Times, out of an innocent curiosity to find out what was really going on. In my ignorance, I believed that perception of world events was the real one. And now I find out that it's not, and that there are many other hidden things going on. My question I put to you today is, how do I identify the real sources? And because you obviously have access to sources that I just
That's not true. I don't have access to anything you don't have access to. There's no secrets in this game. And furthermore, there is no method other than the method that you would pursue if you were taking a biology class or a chemistry class. You have to try to figure out how to evaluate evidence. And that's just a skill that you learn. I mean, when you're doing the natural sciences, that's what it's about. It's like apprenticeship. You pick up the skill of trying to figure out how to evaluate evidence and test theories and see what makes sense and so on. You do the same thing in ordinary life. There is no source you can go to that's going to tell you the truth. Ultimately, you rely on your own critical faculties. Period. There's nothing more to say about it. I mean, you should take for granted that any powerful institution, like, say, the New York Times or the 6 o'clock news, is obviously going to try to mislead and control you. I mean, that should be a truism. What are they in business for? Are they in business to try to undermine themselves? I mean, these are big corporate structures. Are they in business to try to help people undermine them? It doesn't take a genius to figure out they're not doing that. They're in business to try to make you passive and obedient, just like the school system is, which has the same power source. That should be understood by everybody. Now that in itself doesn't get you an avenue to truth, but it tells you where to start. Start by being very skeptical about anything that comes to you from any sort of power system. And in fact, you should also be skeptical about everything else. You should be skeptical about what I'm telling you. Why should you believe a word of it? You know, I got my own axe to grind. So figure it out for yourself, you know. And there is no other answer, any more than there is when you're studying science. Like when I teach, tomorrow I'm going to be teaching graduate courses at MIT, and, you know, students know they're not supposed to believe me. If they believe me, you're not going to, you know, we wouldn't even pass them. You know, they have to challenge what they hear and figure out what's wrong with it and, you know, do it better and so on. In the natural sciences, that's taken for granted. Actually, that's one reason I like MIT and stay there. It doesn't have the atmosphere of the humanities and the social sciences. It has the atmosphere of the natural sciences. And even though the people can be extremely reactionary, it's a much more honest place, just because you're driven by the values of the natural sciences. And everybody should be. You know, that's just ordinary rationality. I don't think you have to teach it to people either. I think you have to beat it out of their heads. Like I think children understand it.
That's the last question. That's all we have time for. So take all your questions. Be disobedient in your classes the rest of the semester. Thank you for coming.
Okay.
We have exactly 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we can be a little, we'll be a little late. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. I'll try to be briefer. Okay, let's not waste any time.
Questions?
You picking? Yeah.
The last group you mentioned briefly that classical liberalism is very anti-capitalist. And I got a sense of what you're referring to, but if you briefly expand on that.
Actually, I'm going to be talking about that in the thing later, and I will expand on it a lot. But if you think about classical liberalism, it was based on the idea of, I mean, like, for example, why was Adam Smith in favor of markets? He was in favor of markets. He gave a kind of a complicated argument for markets, but at the core of it was the idea that if you had perfect liberty, markets would lead to perfect equality. And that's why he was in favor of markets, because he thought that people ought to be completely equal. And that the reason is that he being a classical liberal, he recognized that people's fundamental character involved notions like sympathy and solidarity and right to control their own work and so on and so forth. It's all the exact opposite of capitalism. You know, in fact, there are no 2 points of view more antithetical than classical liberalism and capitalism. That's why when the University of Chicago publishes a bicentennial edition of Smith, they have to distort the text, which they did. In fact, if you read George Stigler's introduction to the bicentennial edition, it's diametrically opposed to the text on point after point. I mean, the extent of the distortion, this is a scholarly edition, you know, University of Chicago bicentennial, so it's kind of interesting to look at it. For example, you know, Smith is famous for what he wrote about division of labor. He's supposed to have thought that division of labor was a great thing. Well, he didn't. He thought division of labor was a terrible thing. And in fact, he says that in any civilized country, society, the government is going to have to intervene to prevent division of labor from simply destroying people. Well, take a look at the index, you know, detailed index for this scholarly edition of Adam Smith, and you find that, and take a look under division of labor, you won't find an entry for that passage. It's not there in the index. Okay, well, you know, that's real scholarship. I mean, suppress the facts totally, you know, and present them as the opposite of what they are, and figure probably nobody's going to read the page 473 anyhow, because I didn't. You know, ask those guys who edited it if they ever read the page 473. Answer, well, they probably read the first paragraph and then sort of remembered what they'd been taught in, you know, some college course.
Last night you referred to the kind of work that you do making this kind of political analysis as not very difficult. Anybody can do it. No major principles are involved. And I see what you mean. But on the other hand, I noticed in major paradigm shift for students to be able to begin to accept the possibility that this kind of analysis is out.
That's right.
How do you bridge that gap?
I don't know. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, they've lived through their whole life being taught to obey authority. When you tried to question things, you were beaten down or kicked out. I mean, we all went through schools, unlike I remember my own schooling. If the history teacher told you something you thought was pretty stupid, and you raised your hand and you said, I don't agree with that, I think it's wrong, you were going to be sent to the principal or some bad thing had happened to you. On the other hand, if you just copy down whatever idiocy he said and then regurgitate it on the next exam and then forget about it, you were okay. And you learn that very quickly, And it ends up with a kind of, first it changes people. You become obedient. The other thing is it filters people. People who aren't obedient get in real trouble. I mean, I taught children too, and you can see, I mean, there are some who just don't take your word for it. And the kind of very unfortunate tendency is to try to beat them down because they're a pain in the neck, But what they ought to be is encouraged. Why take my word for it? Who am I? Figure it out. I was lucky to go to a progressive school when I was a kid. I went to a Dewey experimental school, and there it was done routinely. Little children were encouraged to challenge everything, and you sort of worked on your own. You're supposed to think things through. It was a real experience. In fact, it was quite a striking change when I went to I went there from about age 1.5 up till 12, and then it ended. I went to this city high school, which was the pride of the city system. The one, what's called these days a magnet school. Like the one school for academically oriented kids who are going to work on their own anyway. So naturally, it had the worst teachers. It was considered the sinecure of the system. If you were tired of teaching, you could go to that school because those kids are going to study anyhow. They all want to get into college. And it was the dumbest, most ridiculous place I've ever been. It was like falling into a black hole or something. But the transition was so sharp, it really had an effect. In fact, that was the first time I learned I was a good student. It was very competitive, of course, because that's one of the ways of controlling people is making things very competitive. So everybody's ranked, and you know exactly where you are. Are you third in the class, or maybe you move up down to fourth or something like that. And all of this is in people's heads, And so I suddenly learned I'm a good student. The issue had never arisen in 12 years of schooling, 10 years of schooling before that, because everybody was, encouraged to do what they, do their best, and you sort of help people and stuff like that. So the question never come up, As soon as you get into these systems, immediately you're ranked. It's competitive. You got to beat down the guy next to you. And all of those are techniques of enforced obedience. There's nothing necessary about them. I mean, there are other kinds of schooling which don't have them. In fact, I know because I went through it. In fact, as a teacher, I was also teaching in that framework, with a kind of Dewey educational framework. And it can certainly be done. It's not very remote from our experience. It's like very close. But how you break it down after 10 years 15 years of going through this stuff, that's hard. Actually, it's hard in the sciences. One of the things you have to teach people in science, you go to a place like MIT, say, where I teach. I mean, students have to learn that it doesn't matter. In fact, like there's one of the most famous physicists in the world, a guy named Vicky Weisskopf, who just retired, really super physicist. He used to always teach the freshman courses at MIT in physics, and he was famous for saying on the first day, students would ask him, what are we going to cover? And he would answer, it doesn't matter what you cover, it matters what you discover. So we're not going to bother with facts. You can read a book and find them out. We're going to learn how to discover things. Well, yeah, that's what you have to teach people in sciences. And when you get to a high-level place like MIT, it's mostly apprenticeship. Kind of science is like learning how to be a carpenter. I mean, you work with somebody who somehow knows how to do it, and you kind of get the idea and you have the intuitions. Maybe the professor makes up the facts as he goes along, because if they're wrong, you can look up a handbook and get them right. It's not important. And that's the same sort of thing that has to be done in other fields.
Sort of being tried as an antidote to the
English of the obese group, like classes being taught in Black English and advanced and slower students being taught together so that no one suffers and all that kind of stuff. What do you think?
It's interesting that it's called new methods. I mean, those are the old methods. You know? Like tracking is a new thing. I don't know exactly when it starts, but if some of you are in education, you can tell me. But I know that tracking, breaking kids into several tracks at the early stages, that's something new. Like it wasn't true when I was a kid. Everybody was together. I mean, you didn't know who was a slow learner, who was a fast learner. You just learned. You helped each other and stuff. When my kids were in school, by the time they were in third grade, they were ranking every friend of theirs as smart and dumb. Why? Because some of the smart ones, they were told, this guy's smart, he's in third grade, he's in the top track. This one's dumb, he's in a low track, and somebody else in the middle track. I mean, this is mind-boggling, but this is something new. So going back to putting what are called slow learners, meaning just people who are interested in different things and whatever else they do, in one place, that's kind of obvious. In fact, most educational resources should be going to people who are having some problems, who can't just do it on their own, or who don't come from a family where it's all done for them anyhow. I mean, most of what you learn at home, And those of us who were lucky enough to come from, families that valued education or had resources or were, so on, you just do it on your own. I mean, no matter how rotten the teaching is. But there are kids who don't have those advantages, and they're the ones who ought to have the, the resources. As to teaching in Black English, that's a tricky question. It's like teaching Black English is just another language, I mean, if black people owned the corporations, Black English would be considered mainstream English, and what you and I talk would be called some weird dialect. This is just a question of who owns the place. It's just another language. And the question of whether to teach in the native language or in a foreign language is always a tricky question in any society. Like, for example, take Germany, modern society. Most of the people in Germany don't speak German. They have to be taught German. Now it's less true than it was a generation ago, but a generation ago it was completely true. I mean, a person from Bavaria and a person from Northwest Germany couldn't even understand each other. Not the same language. They all had to be taught German, the standard language. And then a question arises. Do you teach the schools in their actual language, which may be Bavarian, or do you teach the schools in the standard language that you're trying to inculcate into them because it's a technique of advancement and a way of getting into the larger society and so on? And those are conflicts of goals. I don't think there's an easy answer to them. There's an advantage to studying in your native language. Naturally, you want to learn how to read. It's easier to learn in your native language than in a foreign language. On the other hand, there's a disadvantage to learning in your native language, namely you're going to be more remote from the centers of power. And you have to figure out how to evaluate that. And Black English is just a special case of it. And we call it Black English. It's just another language. Like where I grew up in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was like the first stop north on the south. When former slaves came up from the south, they stopped in Philadelphia. And I mean, I'd ride in the streetcars. There'd be kids sitting behind me. I didn't understand a word they were saying. Literally, not one word they were saying. They were just talking another language. It's what we call Black English. I was talking white English, different language. But they're just two languages. It's like French and German. There's no further question about them. If you have a French kid in a German school, should they be taught in French or in German? Well, there are advantages both ways.
What you think about, for instance, some of the great leaders of change and spiritual leaders, like Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, Dalai Lama, and you don't seem to mention that when you speak. It seems like it's these co-ops or corner grocery stores or something like that. But looking at change they have brought on.
Well, let's take Martin Luther King. See, I think Martin Luther King was an important person, but I don't think he was a big agent of change. In fact, I think Martin Luther King was able to play a role in bringing about change because the real agents of change were doing the work. And the real agents of change were like SNCC workers. SNCC workers. I mean, the real agents of change usually fall out of history, okay, because we have a way of, there's a way of it's necessary to distort history to make it look as if, great men were doing things. That's what part of the way of teaching people you can't do anything, you're helpless. You got to wait for some great man to come around, he'll do it for you. That's part of the technique of disempowering people. But if you take a look at the civil rights movement, that's recent, we can look at it. It began with actually black students mostly. Actually, take say Rosa Parks. The story about Rosa Parks is, this courageous black woman suddenly decided, I had enough, I'm not going to sit in the back of the bus, which is sort of half true, but only half true. Rosa Parks came from a community, a well-organized community, which ultimately, in fact, has Communist Party roots, if you trace it back. It was a community of people who were working together and had, in fact, decided on a plan as to how to break through this system. And she was, in fact, part of the agent of that plan. Highlander School, and so on and so forth. Well, all of that's out of history. What's in history is one person had courage to do something, which she did, but not on her own. Nobody does anything on their own. I mean, she was coming out of an organized community of committed people who had been working together for a very long time. Martin Luther King was able to appear and give speeches because SNCC workers and freedom riders and so on had prepared the ground and taken a brutal beating for it. And these were incidentally pretty privileged kids, many of them. They chose it, they didn't have to do it. And they're the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was important because he could stand up there and get cameras, I think he probably saw it this way. At least I hope he did. He should have seen it this way. Gandhi is the same story, has a very mixed record. If you look at, he was doing all sorts of things. But it was the people who were doing the work on the ground who prepared the basis for Gandhi to sort of articulate things. If you look at real movements, I think it's always like that.
Could you talk about a third party? Because you're always saying that Democrats and Republicans are so similar, and where the third party comes up. And two, have you ever considered running for office, like to work things out on the inside?
Well, I think a third party, or fourth or fifth or whatever party, probably makes a lot of sense in the United States. I mean, it's really a second party. We only have one party as it now stands. We have a kind of a business party with several factions. And countries that have a kind of a labor-based party, a popular party, there's things that can be done. It's not a huge change. I mean, almost every other country has this, but it does offer some options. So, like take Canada right next door, a very similar country to ours, but different in some respects. One of the respects is the labor movement still exists. Another respect is it does have a popular-based party, the NDP, which is kind of mildly social democratic. Now, when the NDP gets into office, they do exactly the same thing as the other parties. I mean, they're indistinguishable. But they nevertheless are kind of like an umbrella party in which labor and women's groups and others can sort of get together and work together and so on. So they can, they can press for particular issues that are of general interest. And you see the difference between Canada and the United States just for that reason. Like, take, say, health. In the United States, where there is no political party, just the business party, certain sectors of the population have been able to get health care for themselves, like the UAW. Some of the stronger unions were able to get pretty decent health care arrangements. The way it worked was that they were given those things instead of salary raises. So, like my university, we got good health care. All right, it was sort of given instead of raising salaries one year. That's the way it was done. So you can get health, if you're well enough organized and strong enough, you can get health care for yourself. But what happened in Canada is that those same groups, the labor movement, did not just get health care for themselves, they got it for the population. And they were able to do that because there was, in fact, a political structure through which they could work, which satisfied common interests, not just their local interests. Lacking that in the United States has never happened. Now, a second party, that is a kind of a populist party, doesn't make a big change in the society. As I say, every other society that's like us has one. But it isn't a step forward. And in that sense, what's called a third party really should be called a second party. Makes some sense. There was the second part, which right. I forgot. I'm not one for us. I mean, my department wouldn't even let me be department chairman because I'd probably ruin everything in 3 seconds. So.
We're going to be disobedient.
I understand your general strategy of critiquing mass media involves basically a picture of hegemonic control at the behest of certain corporate political power interests and corporate business interests. Do you see or do you envision technological developments like email, internet, things like that, which seem to operate on kind of self-regulative democratic principles, albeit within a very narrow sector of society, as well as a formal structure for democratic discourse?
Well, if you can hear, this was things like what about alternatives like, say, internet and electronic communication and so on, which aren't directly under the control of they're not just big corporations like the media are, so therefore might have other options. It's a complicated question, and I think it's an very interesting question. It'll be interesting to see how it works itself out in the next couple of years. As you correctly said, the internet is for a special sector of society. The internet's for the wealthy. You have to be rich enough or privileged enough to be able to get into it. Yeah, but that's wealthy. I mean, professors like to complain about how bad their salaries are, but they're like up in the stratosphere and getting much too highly paid, in my opinion, by the standards of the general population, including me. But the fact is that you got to be part of the relatively privileged part of the population before you're even part of this thing. Now, for that privileged part of the population, remember that this is a taxpayer-supported operation, so it's just part of the general public subsidy to the rich. It's run through. It was actually started through the Pentagon, which is just the way of funneling public resources to the rich. It's there now, and it's like a lot of things. It has a mixed character. So, for example, I'm sure that there's a lot of thinking going on. You can be certain about whether to allow the internet to exist. Part of the problem with it, from the point of view of powerful interests, is it's just too democratic. It's very hard to control what's in it. In fact, I have a daughter in Nicaragua, and the only way I was able to, you couldn't call telephone or anything during the war period. The only way I could contact her was through the Pentagon, because the ARPANET, which is the core of this thing, which is basically a Pentagon system. I'm in it because I'm in MIT, and somebody there was in it because I don't know why. And you could sort of set up email connections between, say, me and my daughter in Managua during the Reagan War through the Pentagon. Okay, well, that's the kind of thing that happened. And, a lot of people don't like that, obviously. And they don't like the fact that you can get the GATT treaty and you can get the latest news like stuff that I've been talking about, almost all of it you can find on the internet if you look. So that's bad. You got to stop that. Yeah, that's Kenya. No email to Cuba. It's interesting. Actually, it's almost cut off in Nicaragua, but not quite. There's still one or two connections. Yeah, Cuba's interesting. I didn't know that. So that on the other hand, it has other advantages. It diverts people. It atomizes people. When you're sitting in front of your tube, you're alone. There's something about human beings that makes face-to-face contact very different from banging on a computer and getting some noise coming back. That's very impersonal, and it breaks down personal relations. And that's a good part of it from the point of view of power, because it makes people less human. And a very important thing is to drive human sentiments out of people. So if you can eliminate things like face-to-face contact and, direct interaction and so on, and just, turn people into sort of like what's caricatured as a kind of MIT nerd, somebody who's kind of got an antenna coming out of his head and is wired into his computer. If you can turn everybody into that, it's sort of an advantage, because then you've really made people even more inhuman and therefore more controllable and so on. And there's other complicated things, like, one thing I've noticed recently, I don't know if you've noticed this, David, is that a lot of activists are dropping subscriptions to left journals. Why? Because they can get it through the internet. Well, now, if I was in the CIA, I would be saying, look, let's let this thing go, because even if they get it's true that it has the negative effect of allowing people to get more information, but it has the positive effect of destroying alternative institutions. Okay, so therefore, let's let it go, because when these guys stop their subscriptions to, I don't know, Z Magazine or something, then that's going to destroy that institution, and that'll separate people even more. So if there's anybody, I doubt there's anyone in the CIA with this much brains, but if they had enough brains, they would say, let's let the thing go, because it'll probably destroy the dissident institutions. And it'll destroy them because we're so antisocial that we don't see the point of supporting institutions. Everybody's out for themselves, remember. That's what you're taught from childhood. Even if you're on the left, you still have that ingrained. Like you're an activist, you still have ingrained in your head, I'm out for myself. And therefore, if I can get the information for nothing, why should I help build an institution? That's a very antisocial attitude. But you find it, it's very hard to break out of it. I mean, we're just got it. So, it's got that character. The long-term tendency of the internet, my suspicion is it will be like some article I read somewhere, I forget, maybe the Wall Street Journal or something, which was describing the great potential of this thing. And it went something like this. It said that this is interactive, so it said, well, here's the kind of thing you can look forward to. There's an upbeat account. It said, everybody's going to have this, everybody's going to be tied into it, and we'll be able to have people really interacting in a new way. And then it gave two examples of how it could work, one for women, one for men. For women, they could be sitting there, in front of all their equipment, and on 83 home shopping channels, models show up waving something and sort of giving you the message, you better have that or else something terrible will happen to you. So they can say, okay, I better have that. And then they can push a button. That's the interactive part. And 10 minutes later, something's delivered at the front door. Okay, that's women interactive. What about men? They said, well, men, like the red-blooded thing to do for men is like watching the Super Bowl. Now when you watch the Super Bowl, it's completely passive, just drinking a beer and that sort of thing. But now it's going to be interactive. So before the quarterback's in a huddle and all that sort of thing, and the interactive part will be there'll be a message flashed out to all the red-blooded men, and they'll be supposed to say, look, here's what I think the next play ought to be. Like I think it ought to be a pass, and you push a button that says pass. And then after the quarterback calls the play, he's not listening to you, of course. Or the coach actually calls the play, I guess, and tells the quarterback. It'll be flashed on the screen, 63% thought it should have been a pass, and so on. That's the interactive part for men. So everybody's really involved now in society, like women buying stuff they don't want and spending money, and men, becoming even more imbecilic than they're already made to be, and so on. And that's all to the good, because that's a way of controlling people. And if you let the thing run, that's where it's going to go, something like that. On the other hand, it does have alternatives. Actually, some of them are being thought about right in Chicago, right now. There's a community-based group, Chicago Media Network or something, which involves Afro-American journalists and teachers union and others who are trying to get an alternative cable channel, a community-based cable channel. Well, I was just told yesterday we were sort of beaten down in the court somewhere, and they're now filing another court suit. But that's the kind of thing that could happen. Now, unless they get support, they're going to lose. If they get public support, they're going to win. And that's exactly the way these things work. You will get public. These things can be useful, very important as alternative sources. In fact, as the only sources. As the real public sources, if people are willing to fight for them. If they're not willing to fight for them, they'll end up with home shopping and the Super Bowl. And you're seeing an example of it right here, right in front of you, in this Chicago Media Action Group. And get involved, you can make a change. Forget about it, nothing will happen. The guys who are there's some groups who are always fighting. Big business is always fighting. They don't stop. And if other people aren't involved in the struggle, they win.
About praxis and race. I was struck this morning by how much you talked about or around race, but not on it. And one question that came previously really related to praxis. And one of the propositions I want to put to you, maybe facilitate an exchange, is about the idea that, say, for example, many on the left, including yourself, don't have a praxis. And that is partly related, of course, to the absence of the Labour Party in the United States. But also the proposition that the reason why there is difficulty in organizing on the left in the United States is because the ideology of racism is so pervasive in the United States that it prevents organization among the people who are, of course, who have the most reasons to be dissatisfied with the system. And therefore, I'm implicitly criticizing the left as well. There's racism on the left. And one point that has been made about the distribution of power in the world, especially as it relates to education, is that and this comes in the form of an anecdote, if Hemingway was Turkish, no one would have heard of Hemingway. My proposition is, if Chomsky was black, anyone have heard of Chomsky? Or would he just be dismissed as another black man with a chip on the shoulder who's just concerned about black issues?
I don't know. I mean, let's take the publisher that I mainly publish with, South End. The main seller in South End happens to be Bell Hooks, black woman. If you go down a little, it's people like, I'm one of them, but Manning Marable is another, black intellectual. Look, the fact that there's plenty of racism in society, and it's in the left too, absolutely, nobody's going to argue that. Of course there is. But I don't see why it can't be overcome. It can't be overcome, and I think there have been attempts to overcome it. Like, take the Panthers. One of the reasons why Fred Hampton was killed was that he was opening up things to poor whites, and in fact to whites generally. I mean, I was at Fred Hampton's funeral, and possibly. I mean, Martin Luther King was popular, First of all, Martin Luther King was opposed, strongly opposed. Like, the Kennedy administration really disliked him, and they tried to block him in every possible way. But it finally got to the point where they couldn't stop it any longer, so they pretended they liked him. But then, and there was a period of sort of popularity for King when he was seen to be focusing on extremely narrow issues, like racist sheriffs in the South and so on. Okay, we can be against that. As soon as Martin Luther King turned to broader issues, whether it was the Vietnam War or the Poor People's March was the last one, he became, a pariah. Now, I don't know whether that's why he was killed or not, but he certainly became a pariah because he was just focusing on general issues. And a year or two, about that time, the Panthers were getting organized. And in fact, the Panthers were unusual for an urban-based black group in that they were trying to reach out and did so. There were good connections. I mean, it was a tricky business because the Panthers were like other, any group that's coming out of urban society is going to be a big mixture. So like the Panthers had criminal elements, they had hustlers, they had serious organizers. It was like a mixture of everything. The ones who survived, incidentally, are the criminal elements because the police didn't care much about them. But the Hampton types were destroyed, and they had white-black. I was with a mainly white group, Resist, which had good contacts with the Panthers back in the late 60s. Like I say, I was invited to the funeral. There was no reason why this couldn't continue except that, I wasn't able to resist outside force. So the racism is certainly there, and you got to watch it. But it doesn't seem to me it can't be overcome,
Bell Hooks and Manning Marble, actually, I respect a lot of them. Actually now developing a practice at Columbia with many of his ideas about shell capitalism and so on in the United States. But still, the issue is that when these people are presented, certainly by the left and others, they're presented as black intellectuals.
Well, that's because, but he presents himself that way. No, look,
a white guy comes.
That's not fair. Look, Manning Marable presents himself that way. It's not that anybody else presents him that way.
Is that the value of his analysis cuts across racial lines.
Sure, but the people who read him understand that.
Pardon me?
People who read him understand that, and they accept his picture of himself as an African-American intellectual, which is correct. That's his picture of himself. I respect that, and you recognize that it holds generally. And look, that's been true of the left for a long time. It takes somebody like C.L.R. James. Well, he was a left intellectual, happened to be black, but he was a leading left intellectual. And while you're absolutely right in saying that there's plenty of racism in the left, it seems to me that's the place where there's been least of it. And in fact, it's kind of interesting if you look at labor history. So take, say, the Homestead strike, which I mentioned before. I don't think there were very many blacks there, but there was plenty of the equivalent of racism. I mean, at that time, it was against the Huns. Anybody from Eastern Europe was called a Hun. It's like from Slovakia or Hungary or anything like that. And they were treated just like blacks. And there was vicious ethnic hatreds in Homestead and that region. They were overcome during the strike. That was the first time that people actually cooperated across ethnic grounds because they were fighting together for something. That happened in the formation of the CIO. Then it was a lot of black workers. Black and white workers were actually working together on the CIO. And it seems to me there are plenty of common, and that happened in the civil rights movement. There are plenty of common struggles which bring people together. Like SNCC, for example, was very open. It was white, black, anything. And SNCC got destroyed, and I think that's part of the reason for it. So your point is right. The society is very racist. It's got other kinds of divisions, and you got to keep conscious of them, and you have to overcome them. About the praxis point, I'm not so sure I agree. I mean, when you say there's no praxis, I don't exactly know what that means. I mean, there are plenty of things that can be done. I don't think they have to be described with fancy terms. And we do the things that can be done, the kinds of things that are the next stage where we are now. And I don't think that there's any general formulas about that. You just ask where you are, what are the problems that exist, where are people ready to move, and you try to do something with them. There's a spectrum of them, and there's no simple answer as to which ones should have the priorities. People judge differently. But I'm very skeptical if somebody comes down with a praxis, like some formula saying, here's the way we're supposed to do it. I'd be really skeptical about that.
We have time for one more question, a brief question, because we have about 5 minutes, or else the dean will be.
First of all, I want to say just very quickly that last night I saw this Time magazine with the front cover regarding that IQ book that you had mentioned, and I was just appalled by it.
No,
because I thought if
racism.
I was a black man in this country, I would not know what to do with myself.
How about if you were a black woman?
O.J. Simpson.
How about a black woman? Did you read the article?
Or a black woman.
The article claims that one of the things it discusses is the idea that black women don't nurture their children. And that's because they came from Africa where the climate was such and such. This is stuff that's right out of the Nazis.
How would I feel? You know what? I don't know what to do. It's just rage. Maybe I would wake up every day. Maybe I'd be despondent. Maybe I try to relate to other people as human beings. But inside there would be a burning fire.
See, but I think I agree with that emotional reaction. But if you think about it, the right way to respond is to ask, what are they doing it for? And they're doing it for a very simple reason. Like I said last night, 40% of the kids in New York, most of them are black and Hispanic, are living below the poverty line. That means they're destroyed. Okay. Well, you can't, and that's the result of very definite social policies which are supported by the New York Times. Okay. There are certain social policies which are driving people down to destruction. Well, you can't say that plainly. So you need some cover. Well, what's the cover? Okay, bad genes. Who knows? Maybe, But once you understand that, then you know how to deal with it. Well, it's not that their audience wants to hear that. It's that some of it does. It's that's the proper ideology, just as it was proper for the Nazis at some point to say Jews are a virus that's destroying our society. It is proper for the New York Times to run articles taking seriously the idea that black mothers don't nurture their children. And take me, Ashkenazic Jews, we're supposed to be at the top. We have small families because that's what we're like. That's why my mother came from a family with 11 kids, because Ashkenazic Jews have small families. Of course, she was an East European, living in a peasant society. Maybe that had something to do with it. No, that's not what social science tells you. Okay, well, that's, these things are such transparent ideological weapons that you shouldn't even bother arguing about them. We should just understand them transparently for what they are. I'm in a real commissar culture, which is dedicated to trying to obscure the most elementary truths, and therefore is able to do things like this on the front cover of the New York Times. Well, that's the world we're living in. And, you can understand the emotional reaction, and it's easily understandable, but it's not the right one. Because what's going on is very transparent. This doesn't have anything to do with evil and God. This has to do with rich, powerful people trying to justify the fact that they are pursuing social policies which are forcing children to die. That's what it has to do with. It doesn't, not in my opinion. I mean, if he does for you, okay, but for me, he doesn't. For me, no, it has nothing to do with God. I don't think he has anything to do with it.